Asterisk tonight. We journey back into the Middle Ages to discover what really happened on a medieval wedding night. Far from the fairy tales, the rituals, the expectations, and the realities were often strange, uncomfortable, and sometimes even frightening. But told here in calm detail, they will simply guide you into gentle rest. Welcome to The Boring Historian. If you enjoy these calming explorations of the past, please do subscribe. It helps this channel keep going. And before we begin, I'd like to ask you, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. I'd love to know. The story of a medieval wedding night does not begin with the couple stepping into a bedchamber. It begins months or even years earlier with the betrothal. In the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely just about two people falling in love. It was about families, land, alliances, and survival. A marriage was a contract as much as it was a union. For nobles, it meant the strengthening of dynasties and the securing of property. For peasants, it often meant ensuring a small plot of land could be worked by two pairs of hands instead of one. But no matter the class, every wedding night began first with an agreement, and with the waiting that followed. In many cases, the betrothal was arranged when the bride and groom were still children. A girl of 12 might already be promised to a boy of 14, sometimes even younger. The idea of the romantic proposal, a man kneeling with a ring, is something from centuries later. Instead, the betrothal was an arrangement between parents, sealed in front of witnesses. It's often a priest, sometimes with a symbolic exchange. Perhaps a coin, or a clasped hand, or even the sharing of a cup of wine. From that moment, the couple was bound. They were not yet man and wife, but their futures were tied together, sometimes for years, as they waited until they were old enough to marry. Waiting carried its own weight. For the bride, it was often a time of training. A noble girl might learn embroidery, music, and the running of a household. A peasant girl might be instructed more practically. How to bake bread, brew ale, tend to animals, and keep a fire burning through the cold of winter. And always there was the silent knowledge that she would one day leave her family home and belong to another household entirely. For the groom, the waiting might mean preparing to inherit land, to manage laborers, or to continue his apprenticeship in a craft. He, too, would feel the expectation pressing down. The day was coming when he must prove himself, both in managing his household and in the marriage bed. As the day of the wedding approached, the emotional buildup became heavier. Few brides and grooms went into marriage knowing one another well. In some cases, they had spoken only a handful of times. In others, they may have never been truly alone together. The mystery of the other, of who they really were, of how they would act, what their touch would feel like, was as much a source of anxiety as of anticipation. Among noble families, betrothals often included detailed contracts. A bride might bring a dowry, sometimes coins, sometimes land, sometimes livestock. A groom in turn might promise a morning gift, a token he would present the morning after the wedding night, symbolizing his commitment to provide for her. These contracts were written down, signed with seals, and carefully kept. For marriages were not merely private matters. They were public, economic, and legal. To marry was to reshape wealth, inheritance, and alliances. Even among peasants where paperwork was rare, the sense of obligation was no less strong. A man who failed to honor a betrothal could face punishment from his community, or even the church courts. A woman who tried to break one might find herself cast out in shame. To be betrothed was a binding matter, and the couple, whether eager or reluctant, carried the knowledge that their lives were set. The waiting also allowed for customs of ritual and superstition. Families might consult astrologers to find an auspicious date. Priests might offer blessings to ensure fertility. Mothers whispered advice to daughters about what was to come, sometimes bluntly, sometimes evasively. Fathers reminded sons of the importance of heirs, of carrying the family name, of not failing on the wedding night. For the young bride, the idea of that night loomed in her mind like a shadow. Many had only vague knowledge of what was to come, shaped by fragments of gossip, by the teasing of older women, by half-told stories shared in kitchens and at wells. Some brides were frightened, some were curious. Some resigned themselves quietly, knowing that their body was not entirely their own, but part of the family's alliance and duty. For the groom, too, there was pressure. to perform, to prove himself, to show strength. Failure could mean shame, whispers, even annulment if heirs never followed. In this long waiting, the couple often lived their separate lives, watching from a distance. Perhaps they caught sight of one another at a feast, at the market, or in church. Their eyes might meet, shyly, nervously. They might wonder in quiet, private thoughts what the other's voice would sound like in intimacy, what their life together would become. And always the wedding night was there, waiting at the end of the path, a threshold that could not be avoided. By the time the day itself arrived, the betrothal had done its work. The couple stood at the threshold, not as strangers chosen by chance, but as people bound by duty, expectation, and long anticipation. The feast, the laughter, the ceremonies, all these would come. But in the quiet of their thoughts, both bride and groom carried the same question. What would really happen when the doors of the bridal chamber closed? And so as the sun sets on the day of betrothal and the long months of waiting, we step forward to the next chapter. The wedding day itself, with all its noise, its rituals, and its heavy sense of inevitability, the long months of waiting are finally over. At last, the wedding day arrives. In a medieval village or town, a wedding was not a private event tucked quietly away. It was a public celebration, a binding of not just two people, but of two families, and often of two communities. From the first light of dawn, the day would be marked by ritual noise, and gathering all of it, building toward the moment when the couple would finally be led to their chamber, the morning began with the ringing of bells. Church bells were central to life in the Middle Ages, and on a wedding day their sound carried far, calling villagers and neighbors to witness. The bride, dressed in her best gown, would prepare with the help of family and attendants. Contrary to the modern vision of a white wedding dress, medieval brides wore their finest clothes, whatever the color. Blue was common, symbolizing purity and fidelity. Rich fabrics like velvet or brocade were rare and reserved for the noble classes, while peasant brides might wear a gown of simple wool. Newly cleaned and perhaps decorated with ribbons or embroidery for the special day. The groom, too, dressed in his best, a tunic of bright color, a belt of leather, or even silver, and if he could afford it, a cloak or fur to display wealth and status. For both, clothing was not only practical, but symbolic, a way of showing the community that this was a day of honor and importance. Once prepared, the couple was led to the church. The marriage itself was a sacred act, performed at the church door rather than inside. There, in front of family, neighbors, and clergy, vows were spoken. Hands were joined, words recited, and rings, if available, exchanged. The priest blessed the union, asking God for fertility, prosperity, and strength. The kiss of peace sealed the promise, and then, with prayers concluded, the marriage was official. But it was only the beginning of the day. From the church, the celebration spilled into the village square, or the great hall of a manor, depending on the family's status. Here the feast began. Long tables were laid with whatever food the community could provide. For the poor, it might be coarse bread, pottage, and ale. Plain fare, but shared in abundance. For the wealthy, the tables bent under roasted meats, spiced sauces, exotic fruits brought from distant lands, and sweet pastries glazed with honey. Spices like cinnamon or cloves were treasured luxuries, and their presence at a wedding table announced both wealth and honor. Ale flowed freely, as it always did. Wine, where available, was poured for the higher classes. Drinking was not a mere indulgence, but an expectation, a way of loosening tongues, of lifting spirits, of binding the crowd in laughter and song. It was understood that the wedding feast was not a time for solemn restraint. It was noisy, raucous, and sometimes crude. Music filled the air. Minstrels played lutes, fiddles, and drums, their melodies carrying both joy and bawdiness. Dancing was common, though not always in the paired, graceful style of later centuries. Instead, villagers might form circles, stamping and clapping in rhythm. While noble guests performed more measured steps, bows, and turns, laughter echoed from the hall or the open square, carrying into the streets, where even those not invited might still feel part of the celebration. With food and drink, came toasts. Guests raised their cups to the health of the couple, wishing them children, prosperity, and peace. Some of these toasts carried humor, often at the expense of the bride and groom. Medieval humor was earthy, direct, and unashamed. Songs and jests hinted at what awaited the couple that night, drawing blushes and laughter in equal measure. The feast was more than a meal. It was a display of community strength. For nobles, it was a demonstration of power, showing their wealth to allies and rivals alike. For peasants, it was a rare chance to eat and drink beyond the daily norm. To share in joy, to forget, for a few hours, the grind of labor and hunger. Weddings tied people together, and the feast was its visible proof. Yet beneath the noise, the bride and groom carried a quieter awareness. Every laugh, every song, every cup raised, pushed them closer to the moment of the chamber. They smiled, they danced, they spoke with guests, but always they knew the night was coming.
The feast was a path leading there.
Custom dictated that, as the feast reached its height, guests would begin to push the couple toward the bedchamber. Sometimes this was playful, with laughter and cheering. Sometimes it was more ritualized, with priests or elders leading a solemn procession. In certain regions, the bridal couple was escorted with torches or candles, symbolizing light, fertility, and the hope of a bright union. Before they left, however, one more custom often took place: the sharing of the wedding cup. Bride and groom both drank from the same vessel, symbolizing their new life together. Sometimes this was wine, sometimes ale, sometimes a spiced drink prepared especially for the day. The taste lingered on their lips as they rose, guided by friends or family, toward the chamber. The mood could shift here, from joy to tension. The laughter of the feast followed them, echoing faintly down corridors or across the courtyard. But as they stepped closer to the chamber door, the air grew heavier. Guests might continue to sing crude songs outside, or they might fall into hushed whispers. Everyone knew what came next. The feast, for all its abundance, noise, and color, was only the opening act. It filled the body with food, with warmth, with drink, but it was also designed to prepare the couple for what lay ahead. The chamber was waiting, its bed prepared, its sheets fresh, its candles flickering. The celebration had been public, shared with many eyes and ears. Now, soon, the union would become private, though even then it was rarely entirely free of watching eyes. And so, the feast wound down, and the couple, bound by ritual, bound by duty, bound by expectation, led toward the threshold. Beyond it lay the bridal night, the moment toward which every contract, every waiting year, every bite of bread and sip of ale had been leading. The feast has quieted. The echo of music lingers faintly in the air, muffled now by distance and stone walls. The laughter of guests fades into murmurs. And outside the chamber door, the noise of the wedding day ebbs into something slower, more deliberate. Within the household, servants move quickly, though carefully, preparing the chamber where the bride and groom will be led. The bridal chamber was never just another room. It was symbolic. A stage upon which the marriage would be tested, confirmed, and in some traditions, even witnessed. The bed itself became an altar of sorts, a place where two lives joined, not merely spiritually, but physically, with consequences that would ripple far into the future. Heirs, lineage, inheritance, the continuation of family honor, all of these hung upon what was to happen here. First, the bed was made ready. Sheets were stretched and smoothed, sometimes newly woven for the occasion. White linen, when it could be afforded, symbolized purity. In humbler homes, coarse but clean fabric sufficed, perhaps decorated with simple embroidery stitched by female relatives. In noble houses, the bed might be layered with rich coverings, furs to ward off cold, or brightly dyed blankets displaying family colors. The very act of laying out the bedclothes carried meaning. Women of the family often took part, whispering prayers or charms as they worked. Candles or rushlights were set burning. Light was not merely practical, it was symbolic. In some regions, torches were carried into the room by attendants and placed carefully in holders to cast a glow over the bed. Fire represented warmth, fertility, and life. To extinguish the lights too soon was seen as unlucky. Some families even lit the chamber with a sacred flame taken from the household hearth. so that the couple began their life together with the same fire that had long warmed the home. Superstitions touched every corner of the room. A sprig of rosemary might be tucked beneath the pillows to ward off evil spirits. A small loaf of bread or a piece of cheese might be hidden nearby, thought to bring prosperity and plenty to the union. In certain places, charms were hung over the bed to ensure fertility, or to protect the bride from the spirits that, according to belief, sometimes preyed upon young women on their wedding night. The chamber was thus not just a room, but a space thick with symbols and safeguards, prepared as carefully as any altar in a church. For nobles and royalty, the preparation could take on a startlingly public aspect. The bed might be displayed before the feast, admired by guests, blessed by priests. It was a way of declaring that this union was not only about private love, but about public duty. The fertility of the couple and the heirs they might produce mattered not just to them, but to the entire realm. Every detail of the bedchamber, from the hangings on the wall to the arrangement of the sheets, could be interpreted as a sign of fortune or misfortune. Servants, too, played their part. In wealthier households, chambermaids would scatter herbs with strong scents, lavender or sage, to freshen the air and calm the nerves of the couple. Water might be left in a basin, a reminder of cleansing. Towels were folded neatly, though the idea of personal hygiene was far different from modern expectations. Still, to present the chamber in order and readiness was an essential duty, for disorder was thought to invite disorder in the marriage itself. And always there were customs to be observed. In some villages, the couple was led into the room by their families, surrounded by guests who crowded close to the door. Laughter and teasing often accompanied this, for medieval humor did not shy away from the body. Guests might call out crude blessings, urging fertility, or even sing Bodhi songs as the bride and groom crossed the threshold. The noise outside the chamber was not a disruption, but a tradition, a reminder that marriage was as much the business of the community as of the couple themselves. In certain noble traditions, the ceremony went even further. The couple was sometimes put to bed under the eyes of witnesses who ensured that the marriage was consummated. Priests might bless the bed before the couple entered it. In extreme cases, though not universally, witnesses might remain in the room, or at least just outside the door, listening for signs that the marriage had been made real. It was a startlingly public intrusion into what we imagine today as the most private of acts. But in the medieval mind, privacy was far less important than legitimacy. To prove the union was vital, and witnesses provided that proof. For the bride, being led into the chamber was heavy with meaning. She was leaving behind her childhood, her family, her independence, and stepping into a role defined by duty. Her silence was often expected. She was not to resist, nor to speak too freely. Modesty and submission were her virtues, and her body itself was seen as part of the family contract. For the groom, too, the pressure was intense. He was expected to show strength, to fulfill his role without hesitation. Failure to do so could bring shame, or worse, annulment. And yet, amid all this ritual and symbolism, there was also the simple human truth. Two young people, often strangers, about to share a bed for the first time. They heard the songs outside the door, the laughter, the teasing calls. But inside the chamber, in the dim light of candles, it was just them. As the door closed, the world shifted. The community, the family, the priests, all faded into the distance. The bed waited, the sheets smooth, the herbs fragrant, the fire burning low. The rituals had been performed, the superstitions observed. Now, the chamber itself became the final stage of the wedding, and the night began. The chamber glows faintly, lit by candles that flicker against stone walls or timber beams. The bed is prepared, herbs tucked discreetly beneath the pillows, sheets laid smooth, and the weight of tradition hangs in the air. The bride now steps forward, her gown still upon her shoulders, her hair arranged as it had been for the feast. The garments she wears are not merely fabric. They carry meaning, symbolism, and expectation. And the act of removing them slowly, carefully, is as ritualized as the feast itself. Unlike the modern idea of a white wedding dress, medieval bridal attire varied widely. For peasants, it was often the finest garment the family could provide. worn perhaps only once or twice before, and then carefully stored away. Wool was most common, dyed in modest but vivid hues, earthy reds, deep browns, or blues. Blue, in particular, carried a sacred association with purity and the Virgin Mary, and it was considered especially fitting for brides. For wealthier women, gowns were far more elaborate. A noble bride might wear silk, brocade, or velvet, fabrics imported at great cost from distant lands. These gowns often glimmered with embroidery, pearls, or precious stones sewn into the seams. Sleeves might hang long and flowing or be fitted tightly, displaying the figure in ways both admired and judged. Around the waist, a girdle or belt was tied, often a gift from the groom's family, representing both wealth and the symbolic binding of the woman to her new role as wife. Her hair, too, was part of the attire. A maiden was expected to wear her hair loose or in simple braids, signifying her unmarried state. Once married, she would cover it with a veil or wimple. On this night, however, the looseness of her hair carried weight. It was a sign of transition, of vulnerability, and of readiness. In noble households, a crown or garland might be placed upon her head, often woven with flowers or gilded leaves, further marking her as the center of attention and the bearer of her family's honor. As she entered the chamber, still adorned, she carried with her the last traces of the day's public celebration. The gown was what had been admired during the ceremony, what had been seen at the feast, what had been commented on by family and guests. Now, in the privacy, or near privacy, of the bridal room, the attire shifted meaning. It was no longer a display to the world, but something to be undone, to be set aside, piece by piece. The undressing of the bride was layered with symbolism. In some traditions, it was not the groom who first removed her veil or unbound her hair, but the family. Mothers, sisters, or attendants might gently prepare her, loosening garments, removing ornaments, and placing them aside, as if closing the chapter of her maidenhood. Only then would she be presented fully to her husband, ready for the new role she was expected to embrace. For nobles, this process could be alarmingly public. There are accounts of entire courts observing the putting to bed of the bride, where attendants stripped away the outer garments, leaving her clothed only in a shift, a simple, long undergarment of linen. She would then be led to the bed, veiled and modest, while blessings were spoken. The symbolism was blunt. She was now vulnerable, now ready to be joined. For peasants, the process was more intimate, though still guided by custom. A bride might be undressed by female kin, with laughter and teasing remarks, before being handed to her husband with a final round of advice. The garments themselves held future value. A wedding gown was often kept for years, worn on feast days, or passed down to younger relatives. Jewelry, belts, and veils might be treasured as heirlooms. But in this moment, as fabric slipped from shoulders, as ribbons were unknotted, the meaning was not practical but ceremonial. Each layer removed was a layer of the past falling away. She was no longer her father's daughter, no longer a maiden, but a wife, claimed, marked, and transformed. For the groom, too, the sight of undressing was charged with expectation. He was not merely watching a woman remove her garments. He was witnessing the unveiling of his future, embodiment of his family's alliance, the vessel through which heirs might come. And yet, beneath the layers of duty and tradition, there might also have been nervousness, wonder, or even a tenderness unspoken. The medieval mind was steeped in ritual, but the human heart often strayed quietly beneath it. Superstitions clung even to the act of undressing. Shoe placed beneath the bed might protect against evil spirits. A belt or girdle, once untied, could be hung over the bedpost to encourage fertility. In some regions, garments were carefully folded and placed near the hearth, ensuring warmth and continuity for the household. Nothing was without meaning, for every action on the wedding night was thought to shape the fate of the marriage. Finally, when the bride stood in only her shift, the simple linen garment that touched her skin, the transformation was complete. The fine colors of the gown, the glitter of jewels, the garlands of flowers, all were gone. What remained was plainness, simplicity, vulnerability, and in that plainness lay the true symbolism of the moment. The stripping away of public display, the lowering of barriers, the surrender to duty. The groom, too, shed his garments, though with less ceremony. His tunic, belt, and cloak were set aside, his boots pulled off, leaving him in his own shift, or simply bare. Unlike the bride, his undressing carried less ritual weight, but the expectation was no lighter. He, too, was stepping into a role defined by society, bound to prove himself capable of what lay ahead. And so, in the dim light, garments lay folded or discarded, flowers wilted, ribbons untied. The bride and groom stood together, stripped of the day's pageantry, stripped of the laughter of the feast, stripped of all but the quiet weight of expectation. The attire had been worn, admired, and set aside. What remained was the body, the silence, and the beginning of the act that the world outside waited for. Beyond the chamber, voices might still sing, mocking and crude, filling the night with noise. But here, within, the bride's attire lay still, no longer needed, no longer hers alone. The ritual of undressing was complete. Now came the ritual of joining. The groom, too, carried his own invisible weight on that first night. If the bride's body and honor were under the scrutiny of her family, then the husband's role was no less fraught with expectation. In the dim candlelight of the bridal chamber, he was not only a man about to lie with his new wife, he was a representative of his family, of his lineage, of all that was promised in the contract signed before witnesses. To falter was to invite whispers. To fail was to risk disgrace. In medieval society, a man's virility was not his private affair. It was measured, noted, and sometimes even tested in cruel ways. A noble groom might find that the servants, or even members of his wife's family, lingered outside the door, waiting for signs that the union had been properly sealed. The expectation was not simply intimacy, it was consummation. Without consummation, the marriage could be declared invalid. Contracts broken, alliances undone. The groom's body, in this way, became a tool of politics and property just as much as his bride's. The burden weighed differently depending on status. A peasant groom, poor but eager, might face less formal scrutiny, though the gossip of neighbors was no less sharp than the judgment of lords. Among the wealthy, however, first night could feel like a performance staged for the benefit of those who would profit from the union. In some regions, traditions required the groom to present the bloodied sheets the next morning as proof of virginity and consummation. The pressure to provide such evidence meant that his role was not merely romantic hit, was contractual. Imagine him sitting at the edge of the bed, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and herbs strewn on the floor to ward off ill spirits. The weight of silence pressed upon him. His bride, anxious and uncertain, awaited his move, and behind her quiet eyes was her own fear of what was to come. The groom carried not only his own nerves, but also the burden of demonstrating strength, control, and fulfillment of duty. Failure could mark him for life, whispered about as a man incapable, mocked by rivals, pitied by friends. Yet beneath these expectations lay something more human. Some grooms were as frightened as their brides. Marriage was often arranged, leaving little space for true affection before the union. To step into the chamber was to enter an unknown intimacy, guided by duty more than desire. Some men, kind and patient, sought to ease the fear of their wives. Others, hardened by cultural norms of dominance, approached the night as a task to be completed, rather than an experience to be shared. In the shadows of the medieval chamber, masculinity itself was tested. A husband was expected to embody strength, fertility, and the promise of heirs. The burden was heavy. And the silence of that first night was often louder than the feast and music that had filled the hours before. And so, the groom, though outwardly celebrated as the master of his household, often entered his marriage under pressure as intense as that of his bride. The night was not just about love or passion, it was about proof, lineage, and the fragile balance of honor in a world where family reputation was everything. The medieval wedding night was never truly private. What we imagine today as an intimate moment between two people was, in some cases, overseen, watched, blessed, or even commented upon by others. This intrusion might seem shocking to modern sensibilities, but in a society where marriage was as much a contract as a personal bond, the presence of witnesses was thought necessary. In noble houses, it was not unheard of for family members, trusted servants, or even a priest to accompany the couple into their chamber. The purpose was not always to linger, though some did. Often it was to bless the bed, sprinkle holy water upon the sheets, and murmur prayers over the union. The church, after all, taught that marriage was a sacred sacrament, and its consummation a holy act when performed within wedlock. What today we might think of as deeply personal was, to the medieval mind, a matter of divine order and social record. In certain regions, the bride and groom might be led to their bed in a public procession, still clothed, while songs or blessings were recited. The couple would be laid together upon the bed, the covers drawn over them, and prayers said aloud as the community looked on. Only then would the witnesses withdraw, leaving the pair to their uncertain night. The symbolic act was more important than comfort. It was a ritual that announced, here lies a marriage, and here begins the promise of new life. Some traditions were stranger still. In parts of France and Germany, it was said that attendants sometimes remained just outside the door, listening, waiting for the unmistakable signs of consummation. At times, grooms were expected to produce proof the next morning blood on the sheets, a cloth carried forth as evidence that the bride's virginity had been surrendered. Servants might collect these linens and deliver them to waiting family members who would celebrate or whisper accordingly. For peasants, the practices were often simpler, but no less communal. A village might escort the couple to their cottage, banging pots, shouting bawdy songs, or playfully harassing them as they entered the door. The chivalry, as it was sometimes called, was less about blessing and more about ensuring that no one forgot the importance of the night. Privacy was a luxury, and a new marriage belonged as much to the community as to the two individuals themselves. The bride and groom, lying beneath their blankets after the last footsteps had faded, would have been acutely aware that they were not alone, even in solitude. Their family's expectations, their priest's blessings, the village's laughter all lingered in the silence. The wedding night, far from a private affair, was a stage upon which the continuation of bloodlines and the strength of alliances played out. To be watched, to be blessed, to be judged, this was the strange burden of the medieval marital bed. And though the candles were snuffed and the doors closed, the couple knew that their every movement and its outcome might soon be discussed by others at the morning table. The medieval wedding feast was rarely a quiet affair. Tables groaned under roasted meats, trenchers of bread, and bowls of pottage, but above all, pitchers of ale and goblets of wine flowed without end. For many couples, the long hours of eating and drinking before their wedding night were not merely for celebration. The steady pour of alcohol served a practical purpose. It dulled nerves, softened anxieties, and, in some cases, made the daunting expectations of the bedchamber more bearable. Ale was the everyday drink of common folk, safer than water and always at hand. On the wedding day, it was brewed stronger, richer, and carried with it the warmth of festivity. For peasants who had worked hard in the fields, the sudden abundance of strong ale was both luxury and liberation. By the time the bride and groom were led away to their chamber, their heads often swam with drink, blurring fear with laughter, and turning the unknown into something less sharp. Among nobles, wine was the drink of choice. Imported casks from Gascony or Italy were opened, their contents poured freely into jeweled cups. Mead, too sweetened with honey and spiced with herbs, was reserved for such occasions. The very word honeymoon recalls this custom. For newlyweds might be supplied with mead for the first month of their marriage, in hopes that sweetness in drink would bring sweetness in union. Alcohol carried with it more than merriment. It was a quiet form of permission, an excuse for hesitation to be overlooked. A groom who might stumble in his duties could later blame the wine. A bride, too frightened to speak, might hide her trembling beneath the haze of ale. In a world where duty overshadowed desire, intoxication allowed space for awkwardness, transforming the unbearable into something tolerable. Yet drink was not always a comfort. Too much could turn celebration into clumsiness, laughter into quarrel. There are accounts in manorial records of drunken grooms unable to perform their expected role, mocked by family or scolded by priests. The irony was cruel. The very drink that gave courage could also rob the body of its strength. Still, few weddings passed without cups raised high, their contents swallowed not just for joy, but for the courage needed when the feast ended and silence fell. In the dim candlelight of the bridal chamber, the lingering warmth of ale or wine may have eased the trembling hands of a groom, or dulled the fearful thoughts of a young bride. The first night of marriage, charged with duty and heavy with expectation, was rarely a matter of romance. But with enough drink in the blood, the edges of fear could be softened, if only for a while. When the door to the bridal chamber closed, another world of silence began. For the medieval bride, silence was not simply the absence of words. It was a duty, a posture, and a virtue. From the moment she crossed the threshold of the room, she was expected to be still, restrained, and passive, her role carefully shaped by centuries of custom, religion, and social expectation. The young bride often arrived at the chamber already steeped in instruction. From her mother, her aunts, or even from the priest's whispered counsel, she had been told that modesty was her armor. A woman who spoke too freely, who resisted, or who expressed her own thoughts too openly was judged as shameless. Instead, the ideal bride was quiet, lowering her eyes, allowing her husband to take the lead. To be silent was to be virtuous, and to be virtuous was to honor both her family and her God. This silence was not simply personal, it was ceremonial. In noble households, where witnesses might escort the couple to their bed, the bride's quietness was part of the performance. Laughter, jokes, and ribald songs might surround her, yet she was expected to endure them in silence. Even in peasant cottages, where the bed was humble and the chamber shared with others, the stillness of the bride was a kind of script rehearsed by countless generations. There was another layer to this quiet. For many brides, especially the very young, or those unfamiliar with their husbands, the silence masked fear. The marriage bed was not a place of romance, but of duty. A woman's body was no longer her own, it belonged to her husband, her family's lineage, and, by extension, the wider community. Speaking of fear, of pain, or of reluctance was rarely permitted. So silence became a shield, a way of enduring what could not be openly resisted. Religious teachings reinforced this stillness. Medieval sermons often reminded women that Eve's words had brought ruin into the world, while Mary's quiet obedience had restored hope. To be silent, then, was to follow Mary's example, to embody patience, submission, and purity. Even in moments of pain, the ideal wife bore her burden with lips closed, her suffering hidden beneath lowered lashes. In practice, however, silence did not always mean consent. Records survive of women later confessing to nuns or priests that their first night was marked by confusion, by discomfort, or even by terror. Yet such confessions came long after, spoken in whispers to ears bound by secrecy. On the wedding night itself, silence remained the only option. To cry out, to resist, or to protest might bring shame not only upon herself, but upon her entire family. Among wealthier households, the silence of the bride might even be observed by others. Servants stationed outside the chamber, or relatives waiting nearby, would listen for sounds from within. A hushed stillness was interpreted as virtue, while too much noise might stir gossip or ridicule. The silence was not just personal, it was public, policed by a community that measured honor in whispers and restraint. For poorer women, the reality was harsher. Their silence was less about ceremony and more about survival, dependent upon their husbands for food, shelter, and safety. Many brides had little choice but to remain quiet, no matter how uncomfortable or unwilling they felt. Their stillness was an act of endurance, one of many that would follow in the hard years of marriage and work to come. And so, in cottages and castles alike, the silence of the bride was one of the most enduring rituals of the medieval wedding night. It was a silence heavy with meaning, virtue, obedience, fear, and resignation, all bound into one. A silence that spoke louder than words, echoing in the dimly lit chambers where so many new marriages began. The chamber is quiet now, though the echoes of music and laughter from the great hall still drift faintly through the heavy wooden door. The fire has burned low, casting flickers of amber light across the bed where the bride and groom rest or, perhaps, sit in silence, caught between exhaustion, duty, and the unspoken weight of expectation. For though the vows are made and the feast is concluded, there remains one more ritual to be fulfilled before the marriage can be considered truly valid in the eyes of family, community, and church. It is the ritual of proof, the demonstration that the bride was, indeed, untouched before this night, and that the union has been sealed in both spirit and body. To modern minds, such a practice may seem intrusive, even cruel. Yet in the medieval world, virginity was not only a personal virtue, but also a matter of family honor, social standing, and property. A bride entered the marriage not as an entirely free soul, but often as a vessel of alliances, inheritances, and the continuation of bloodlines. The question of her purity was not hers alone, belonged to her parents, to her husband, and to all those who had negotiated the marriage. The wedding night was therefore not only about intimacy, but also about public assurance, however private the act. The ritual varied from place to place and from century to century, but at its core was the same: the expectation of blood. The breaking of the bride's maidenhead was supposed to leave a stain, a mark on the white sheets, a visible proof that she had been untouched before. Servants, mothers, or sometimes even priests would later be shown the linens. A spot of red was celebrated. It meant honor for her family and legitimacy for the union. But the absence of it could spell disaster. One can imagine the tension this created within the bridal chamber. The groom, often young himself, bore the burden of producing the proof. The bride, whether frightened, resigned, or quietly hopeful, knew that her body now carried the weight of an entire household's reputation. It was not simply about her own life. It was about dowries, land agreements, inheritances, and the fragile balance of alliances. The bed itself was chosen and dressed with care. Often, white sheets were laid to make any trace of blood more visible. In some cases, the sheets were new, in others borrowed or passed down through families. The symbolism was unmistakable. What should have been private was transformed into something almost ceremonial, with the linens as evidence. Some families even embroidered or decorated the edges of the sheets, so that when they were later displayed, there would be no doubt as to whose household they belonged. Yet, as with many rituals, reality was far more complicated than the ideal. Not every young woman bled on her wedding night. Some, through nature, activity, or even accidents, had already torn their hymen long before marriage. A fall from a horse, years of labor in the fields, or even something as ordinary as vigorous childhood play could leave no mark for the sheets to catch. In other cases, a bride may have had intimate encounters before marriage, whether willingly or through coercion, and she would face the terror of discovery on this night. The consequences could be devastating. A groom might reject her, annul the marriage, or worse, shame could fall on her family for generations. But human beings are resourceful, and not all couples or families left such matters to chance. In some regions, older women, mothers, aunts, midwives, were known to advise brides on how to ensure a proof was present regardless of what actually happened. A small cut on the thigh, or a drop of animal blood hidden in a cloth, could serve as substitute. In rare cases, even conspiracies emerged where the sheets were swapped, prepared, or secretly marked before being revealed to the household. The ritual may have been intended to uphold truth, but often it existed as a stage for performance and pretense. The act of displaying the sheets varied widely. In some villages, it was a quiet and discreet moment, handing the linens to a servant who would whisper confirmation among the household. In others, it was almost celebratory, with the blood-stained sheet paraded before guests as a token of honor. Songs were sung, laughter erupted, and toasts were raised to the groom's virility and the bride's chastity. The merriment, however, concealed the underlying cruelty. The way a woman's worth was measured in such fragile and intimate proof. For the bride herself, the morning after carried an air of final judgment. If the sheets bore their expected mark, she might feel relief, perhaps even pride, knowing that her role had been fulfilled. If not, she would live under the shadow of suspicion. Some men were merciful, choosing silence or excuses. Others were not, using the absence as a weapon of control, a reason to seek annulment, or leverage for more dowry from her family. One cannot help but reflect on how much pressure this ritual placed upon young women, often no more than teenagers, married before they had fully understood the complexities of their own bodies. The wedding night was not, as romantic tales might suggest, a moment of mutual tenderness, but rather a test, a trial, with stakes reaching far beyond the chamber. And yet, amidst these expectations, there were also instances of compassion. Some grooms, aware of the cruelty of the ritual, chose to protect their brides. They might quietly stain the sheets themselves, or refuse to display them at all, declaring that their word was enough. Some families, particularly among the lower classes, where survival mattered more than appearances, may have cared little for such proofs. Human stories are rarely uniform within the strict traditions of medieval society. Moments of kindness still found their way. The ritual of the proof of purity endured for centuries, tied to ideas of honor, lineage, and control. It reminds us today of how deeply personal lives were bound to communal expectations, how the most intimate of acts became subject to public judgment. It also reveals the fragility of reputation in medieval society, where a single spot of blood or its absence could determine the course of an entire marriage. As the night passes in our story, the sheets are taken, examined, and quietly judged. Relief or worry spreads through the household, whispers ripple among servants, and the fate of the young couple rests upon a mark of red. The bride, weary and silent, watches as her life shifts into its new chapter. The groom, uncertain but bound by duty, carries the weight of both performance and truth. And beyond the chamber walls, the world goes on. Villagers rise with the sun. While fields await plowing, bells ring for morning prayers. Yet within this room, the drama of purity and honor has played out, leaving its indelible mark not just on cloth, but on lives. The medieval wedding night was rarely a private affair, and perhaps nowhere was this more apparent than in the strange custom of guests lingering outside the bridal chamber to sing, to joke, and to mock. Imagine, after a long day of ritual, feasting, intense expectation, the newlyweds retreating to their bed only to hear voices in the corridor or just beneath the window, calling out bawdy encouragements. It was not considered shameful or cruel, but rather a traditional duty of the community, to remind the couple that their union was as much about society as it was about love. The songs themselves were often crude by modern standards, packed with innuendo and jokes about fertility. Men and women alike might join in, their voices slurred by ale, their laughter echoing down the village streets or castle halls. In France, this ritual came to be known as the charivari, a cacophony of banging pots, loud singing, and jeers meant to mark the consummation of marriage. The English had similar traditions, though they sometimes softened into playful ditties and rhymes, while in parts of Germany, the rowdiness could last for hours. Some songs mocked the nervousness of the groom, others teased the bride for her shyness, and many celebrated fertility with blunt references to the marital bed. For the couple inside, the atmosphere was strange. On the one hand, the noise outside was intrusive, a reminder that they were not entirely alone. On the other, it was also expected, almost comforting in its familiarity. To some brides, it may have felt humiliating, a public spectacle of their most private moment. To others, it may have been reassuring, proof that the community supported their union and their new life together. Picture the scene, the chamber lit by candlelight, the heavy air of incense and sweat, the muffled sound of drunken voices pressing through the walls. Outside, men with tankards in hand lean against the doorframe, laughing as they belt out songs that compare marriage to the breaking of a plow or the sowing of fields. Women join in, teasing the bride in verses about her blushes, while children sometimes peek from behind their parents, giggling at the forbidden humor. The laughter rises, the music grows louder, and then just as suddenly it fades, leaving only the quiet creak of the bed and the whisper of the night. These customs, strange as they may seem today, were rooted in the belief that marriage was not merely a private contract, but a communal one. The fertility of the couple meant the continuation of families, lineages, and villages. The songs, the mockery, and even the embarrassment were part of a larger social ritual that tied everyone together. And so, the medieval wedding night was never entirely the couple's on it was shared, observed, and marked with the voices of the crowd just beyond the door. Not every medieval wedding night unfolded as tradition, church, or family hoped it would. Beneath the weight of ritual, expectation, and song, there always lingered the very real possibility that things could go wrong. And when they did, the consequences could stretch far beyond embarrassment or disappointment, reaching into questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and even the future of entire noble lineages. The most feared issue was impotence, the inability of the groom to perform his conjugal duty. In an age when a marriage's purpose was closely tied to producing heirs, impotence was not merely a personal matter, but a public crisis. Whispers could begin as early as the morning after, when there was no sign of consummation. In villages, this might mean cruel gossip. In noble courts, it could mean the annulment of a marriage and the collapse of carefully arranged alliances. The church took such cases seriously, sending clerics or physicians to examine the couple, and in some notorious trials, husbands were forced to prove their virility before witnesses, an ordeal humiliating beyond measure. Infertility was another shadow over the marriage bed. At first, there was patience time given for the couple to settle into married life. But as the months, then years passed without a pregnancy, suspicion often turned toward the bride. A woman might be accused of being barren, cursed, or punished by God, yet sometimes blame shifted toward the husband, especially if the bride was young and healthy while he was older or known for illness. Remedies abounded: herbal tonics, pilgrimages to saint shrines, prayers whispered in candlelit chapels, but they were rarely effective. Annulment loomed as the ultimate risk when failure became undeniable. Unlike divorce, which the medieval church rejected, annulment declared that the marriage had never truly existed, often on grounds of non-consummation. Such rulings could free a noblewoman to be remarried for alliance purposes, or a man to seek another bride more likely to bear heirs. But for ordinary villagers, annulment was rare. Most couples, successful or not, simply endured together, bound by duty, custom, and necessity. And yet, behind the legal consequences, one can imagine the human cost. For the nervous groom who could not rise to the occasion, shame must have been overwhelming, compounded by the knowledge that his wife, his family, and his neighbors would all know of his failure. For the woman blamed for infertility, life could become an unending trial of whispered insults, prayers that seemed unanswered, and pressure from both family and priest to somehow prove her worth as a mother. In this way, the medieval wedding night was not only a private union, but a test. It was a threshold through which the couple had to pass, and failure to do so could shadow their lives for years. When things went wrong, it was not only the silence of the chamber that bore the weight, but the heavy, watchful gaze of the entire community and church beyond its walls. The medieval wedding night did not look the same for everyone. Much depended on who you were, where you lived, and what your station in life demanded of you. The contrast between noble marriages and those of ordinary peasants could not have been greater. For while the basic expectation of consummation remained constant, the scale, meaning, and consequences varied dramatically. For the nobility, marriage was first and foremost a contract of power. A bride and groom might scarcely know each other before the vows were exchanged, for the match had likely been arranged by their families long before they were of age. The ceremony would be grand, attended by vassals, clergy, and witnesses of political importance. Once the wedding feast ended, the bedding ritual often took on a public air, with lords and ladies leading the couple to their chamber under watchful eyes. In many courts, attendants might linger, offering ribald jokes, songs, and sometimes even staying in the room to ensure that the union was properly begun. For nobles, the proof of consummation was not a matter of curiosity, but of dynastic security. Without heirs, the future of lands, titles, and alliances was uncertain. A sheet stained with blood, or at least with some convincing substitute, was more than a token, it was political evidence. In contrast, the wedding night of peasants was far humbler, though still deeply entwined with community expectations. A peasant wedding might be marked with ale, laughter, and feasting that spilled into the fields or village lanes. Bedding rituals were less formal, though neighbors might still escort the newlyweds to their bed with crude songs and playful jeers. Unlike the nobles who married for property and alliances, peasant marriages were more often based on practical concerns, shared labor, the combining of small plots, or even, occasionally, affection. The consummation mattered, of course, but its proof was less stringently required. The couple's ability to live together and contribute to their community is often considered more important than ceremonial tokens of virginity. Whereas noble brides might be very young, wedded off, as soon as they were legally marriageable, peasant women tended to marry later. Often in their late teens or early 20s, once they could contribute meaningfully to the household economy, nobles had no such luxury. A noblewoman might be pledged in marriage long before she had even left the nursery. This difference shaped the nature of their wedding nights. For a noble bride, the experience was often bewildering, shaped by duty and expectation rather than readiness. For a peasant bride, though no less daunting, marriage tended to arrive when she was more prepared in body and mind. And then there was the matter of consequences. For a noble, a failed consummation, infertility, or rumors of impotence could unravel entire political alliances. For a peasant, while gossip and shame were real dangers, the stakes were smaller, the repercussions more personal than political. A failed wedding night in a village might be whispered about over ale, but it would not alter the course of kingdoms. In this contrast, the dual face of medieval marriage emerges. For nobles, the wedding bed was a stage upon which dynasties rose or fell. For peasants, it was the beginning of a shared life of work, survival, and companionship. Both were shaped by expectation and ritual, but the weight of meaning and the shadows of consequence could not have been more different. The morning after the wedding night was in many ways just as important as the night itself. In medieval society, the wedding was not simply a private contract, but a public act that bound not only to people, but to families, and often entire communities. The dawn that followed was therefore filled with expectations, duties, and quiet rituals that reflected the values of the time. For noble couples, the morning often came too soon. The bride might wake in a grand chamber, its stone walls draped with tapestries and the air heavy with the scent of smoke from the hearth fire that had burned low in the night. Servants would be at the ready, entering discreetly to bring bread, wine, and warm water. If the wedding bedding had been particularly ceremonial, with witnesses present, then the next day's business was the sharing of evidence. In some traditions, the bedclothes, ideally marked with blood, were displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. This ritual could feel intrusive, reducing a deeply private moment to a symbol for the satisfaction of dynastic and political concerns. The couple themselves, often young and strangers to one another, might be left bewildered by how little the moment was truly their own. Yet for their families and their retainers, it was a relief the marriage was begun. The alliance was secure, and heirs could now be expected in due course. For peasant couples, the morning after was less concerned with public evidence but still closely tied to community life. A village marriage was often celebrated not for a single night, but for several days, with neighbors feasting, drinking ale, and dancing in the lanes. The bride and groom might awake in a modest cottage, or even in the home of relatives, on a bed stuffed with straw or leaves. Their first meal together as husband and wife might be nothing more than coarse bread, cheese, and perhaps some pottage left over from the feast. Yet the symbolism was no less meaningful. It marked the beginning of a partnership that would shape their work, their survival, and their hopes for children to carry on the family line. The morning after they might rise early, for life did not pause for long. Animals needed feeding, fields needed tending, and daily labors resumed almost as though nothing had changed. The difference was that now they faced these tasks together. The morning after could also carry with it quiet anxiety. For noble brides, rumors spread quickly, and a whispered suggestion of infertility or of the groom's impotence could stain reputations before the marriage had even begun to bear fruit. For peasant brides, the stakes were smaller, but still real neighbors were curious. Sometimes intrusive, and gossip could linger for months if something was thought to be amiss. Even so, the intensity of scrutiny was lighter than in noble courts, where dynasties truly hung in the balance. There were also traditions of gifts on the morning after. Nobles sometimes exchanged tokens rings, belts, or embroidered garments, signifying the formal start of married life. A peasant groom might gift his wife a simple item, perhaps a tool or a small keepsake, to mark their bond. In some places, there was even the practice of a morning gift, legal arrangement by which the groom granted land, money, or property to his bride, a safeguard for her in case she was widowed. This gesture, though rooted in practicality, was also a symbol of trust and permanence, binding them in both law and affection. And then, as the sun climbed higher, life moved forward. The feast might continue, or the village might slowly return to work. For nobles, there might be further ceremonies, audiences with lords and ladies, or preparations for journeys to estates. For peasants, there was the long road of daily survival, where the glow of celebration faded into the rhythm of toil. The morning after a medieval wedding night was not a leisurely reprieve. It was a turning point, a transition. It was the first day of the rest of their lives, filled with duty, hardship, but also, in their own way, companionship and shared endurance. The fire had long burned down in the bridal chamber, and outside the window, the pale light of dawn had already revealed itself to the world. Yet for the bride and groom, the night was far from a fleeting experience. It lingered, not just in memory, but as a turning point, casting a shadow across the years of marriage that followed. In medieval Europe, the wedding night was not a private affair to be shrugged off or forgotten. It was an event heavy with meaning, expectation, and consequence. And what happened or failed to happen on that first night could define the shape of the union for decades. For many couples, the consummation of marriage was not only about physical intimacy, but also about the binding of families, lands, and fortunes. If the night was deemed successful, the bride was accepted into her husband's lineage, and the husband's manhood was affirmed. Their bond was not just personal but social, a seal of approval upon which inheritance and legitimacy depended. A child conceived on that night would, in some regions, be regarded as especially auspicious, as though it carried with it the blessing of a fresh beginning. But for others, the night carried burdens that grew heavier over time. Timid bride who struggled with fear and silence might find herself misunderstood. Her husband regarding her hesitance as coldness. A husband who faltered in his role whether through nerves. Drunkenness or impotence might live under the shadow of humiliation, whispered about by kin and clergy alike. And so what began as a moment of union could sometimes instead become a quiet rift. That rift, in the medieval household, was rarely spoken of directly, yet it revealed itself in the silences at the hearth, the arrangements of separate beds, or the absence of children. The shadow of that first night reached even further in noble families, where alliances and inheritances hinged on fertility. A bride who failed to provide proof of her virginity could be cast aside or returned to her family in disgrace. A husband who proved unable to consummate the marriage could be challenged in ecclesiastical courts, examined by midwives or physicians in humiliating rituals designed to test his potency. Some couples grew close in the face of such pressures, creating bonds of tenderness out of necessity, while others collapsed beneath the weight, their marriage never truly healing from a night that was supposed to have united them. And so the wedding night became less a single evening and more a beginning that echoed through time. For peasants, the memory of the night might surface in laughter years later. As children crowded the family hearth, the awkwardness of their youth softened by time. For nobles, it might remain a matter of record, preserved in court documents and family chronicles, shaping how future generations judged the worth and honor of their bloodline. In the medieval world, where tradition and superstition guided so much of daily life, the first night was both a threshold and a prophecy. To step across it was to enter not merely into marriage, but into a lifetime of shared duties, expectations, and reputations. For better or worse, the shadow of that night followed every couple, sometimes gentle, sometimes heavy, but always present. And as the medieval bride and groom rose the next morning, their marriage no longer lay ahead of them, and promise it had already been marked for the rest of their lives by what had transpired in the silence, the awkwardness, and the rituals of that singular night. The medieval wedding night was never simply a private affair between two newlyweds. It was the culmination of contracts, expectations, rituals, and superstitions woven tightly into the fabric of society. From the betrothal negotiations and the noisy feast, to the undressing rituals and the heavy silence of the chamber, each moment carried meaning far beyond the couple themselves. To be married was not only to join two people, but to tie together families, fortunes, and futures. The bride and groom, in many ways, were less the authors of their own story and more the players in a performance demanded by custom. Their night was observed, judged, and sometimes even mocked by others. The proof of purity, the crude songs at the door. The risks of failure or rejection, all these elements, made the wedding night as much a communal trial as an intimate experience. For nobles, it meant politics and dynasties. For peasants, it meant survival and legitimacy. For both, it was a threshold into a life that would never again be the same. And yet beneath the rituals and the weight of expectation, were still two human beings, perhaps nervous, perhaps weary, perhaps quietly hopeful, that somehow, amid the noise and judgment of the medieval world, they might find a moment of tenderness or even love. And so, as we close this long story of medieval weddings, take a moment to reflect. Imagine the hush of the chamber after the laughter has faded, candlelight flickering low, the rustle of linen sheets heavy with meaning, and the quiet breath of two people who are at last alone. This has been What Really Happened on a Medieval Wedding Night, Boring History for Sleep. Thank you for listening, for subscribing to The Boring Historian, and for sharing this quiet journey through time. Wherever you are watching, whether in the middle of the night, in the early hours of morning, or while resting after a long day, wish you peace, calm, and gentle rest. Cana. Good night.